Okay, hello everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Matthew Brown. I'm the director of the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology, which is the host of tonight's event. This is the final lecture in our series on viruses, vectors, and values. We've had a variety of lectures and other events, such as film screenings, covering an array of issues related to viruses, disease, epidemics, public health, and the way that those things intersect with our values, our ethical commitments, and our culture. We've seen discussions of Ebola in the context of global health. We've seen discussions of the treatment of the AIDS virus internationally. We have even heard about viruses that are good for you. Tonight we're going to hear a lecture about a very important topic, which is vaccines. We got the viruses and the vectors in there. We're going to get vaccines in as well. I think you're in for a treat with this lecture. Our presenter tonight is Maya Goldenberg. Maya is from the University of Guelph. She's an associate professor of philosophy. She's a feminist philosopher of science and medicine, who has written on topics like evidence-based medicine, patient-centered medicine, breast cancer research and activism, and tonight's topic, vaccine resistance and vaccine hesitancy. Maya's work, I think, is really exciting in the way that it accomplishes something that's central to my heart and to the work that the Center for Values does, which is combining evidence with values, looking at both the scientific practice in a careful way, as well as thinking about society and social justice work. So I think without further ado, please welcome Maya Goldenberg.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Matt, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. So, you can't change an anti-vaxxer's mind. That was the title of a Mother Jones article by science reporter Chris Mooney that came out in 2014. It detailed the January 2014 release of a study by political scientist Brendan Nyhan and colleagues into the effectiveness of communication strategies for persuading parents to vaccinate their children against measles, mumps, and rubella. Recent measles outbreaks and whooping cough, recent measles and whooping cough outbreaks attributed to parents refusing vaccines for their children had generated a lot of public concern. So the study was highly anticipated. The frustrating results, as Mooney characterized them, received a lot of media attention. The study was reported to show that when parents read one of 4 pamphlets aimed at persuading parents to immunize, they became less likely to vaccinate their kids. In other words, the pro-vaccine message was backfiring. Now, rather than interpret these findings as evidence that these 4 interventions just don't work, or more broadly, that a didactic educational model where you provide information to the receiver may be ineffective, the media reports largely concluded that vaccine hesitators simply could not be convinced. They could not be convinced by facts, not by science, not by reason. In fact, vaccine hesitators were immune to truth. Stubborn refusal to accept vaccines is usually attributed to information deficits, this idea that the public doesn't understand the science. But these researchers, Nyhan and colleagues, speculated that their results illustrated cognitive biases in how individuals assimilate information. The media ran with this apparently novel idea that decision makers have a psychology. So Mooney and other pundits quickly drew from psychology research a lexicon of biased reasoning terminology to explain this bind. They discussed confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, motivated reasoning, cultural cognition, and to a lesser extent, conspiratorial ideation. If these terms are not familiar, don't worry, we'll be defining them. All of these terms have been previously employed to make sense of the phenomenology of science resistance and the acceptance of pseudoscientific claims. They've been applied to the recalcitrant climate change debate, for instance. And so the foundation was in place for a much needed change to the familiar vaccine hesitancy narrative from being a problem of poor scientific literacy among members of the public. The news story suggested something much more deeply, this news story suggested something much more deeply entrenched, that there was an inability to think otherwise. Now, many media commentators concluded that the problem was therefore a lot worse than we'd thought. We see this in those fatalistic sounding headlines. Today, I want to highlight the positive implications of these research findings. This change in the characterization of the problem of vaccine hesitancy to one of cognitive biases invites what I think are new, more promising avenues for addressing a problem that has persisted largely because it's been misunderstood and therefore poorly addressed. So this new framework is firstly helpful because I think it permitted pundits to throw out the old theory, which really wasn't a very good one. There was already plenty to suggest that poor scientific literacy or the public misunderstanding of science were not really the cause of vaccine hesitancy. There had been decades of intense public health and health promotion efforts to calm public fears that focused on educating parents on the safety and efficacy of vaccines, also correcting misperceptions, and it's been ineffective in quieting those concerns and elevating rates of vaccine compliance. Vaccine hesitancy persists. By some measures, it's even rising. And vaccine refusal rates have not lowered. Yet at no point did these poor results inspire officials to revise their outreach tactics. Instead, the failures seem to only reinforce the belief that the public could not understand the science. So it wasn't the approach that was the problem, it was the audience. So there was, at face value at least, some legitimacy to the belief that poor public understanding of science was the source of vaccine hesitancy. The American public has scored low on surveys of general scientific literacy for years. So since we often fear the unfamiliar, it stood to reason that resistance to scientific claims stemmed from generally low levels of scientific literacy. But there were weaknesses in this explanation too. Social science research has shown that many willful vaccine refusers are college educated. This seemingly inconsistent finding has led to some grumbling and use of that old cliche, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. But for some reason, it did not invite consideration that maybe we had the story wrong. Also, there's been more than 25 years of science communications research that has strongly discredited this notion of an information deficit as the source of public resistance to scientific claims, and that research had been ignored. So the perceived problem of the public's knowledge deficit has continually guided decades of intensive research to curb intensive efforts to curb vaccine hesitancy and resistance. You'll find pamphlets, blogs, popular science books for parents, guides for healthcare workers, communications when they speak to vaccine hesitant parents that always follow this didactic educational model. They cite numerous large-scale epidemiological studies that show no link between autism and immunized uptake. They correct faulty risk assessments and counter flawed assumptions or factual errors in the vaccine myths that are in circulation. So they apply the evidence. The supposedly scientifically ignorant public have continued not to get it, and this has been a source of frustration, but it has also heightened the resolve to fight the good fight, and that's why the vaccine so-called debate is more of a vaccine war. I could say a lot more about public misunderstanding of science as an inappropriate framework for understanding vaccine hesitancy, but I want to move on. Actually, I have said a lot more of it, so if there's any interest, I've written on this subject. But turning back to this vaccine communication study, one thing that was novel about Nyan and colleagues' work was that it actually tested educational interventions. That's right, the efficacy of these strategies had not been tested in their decades of use. And it was at this point that the message seemed to actually get through to some vaccine pundits. The information deficit was not the problem. Providing accurate and reliable scientific evidence was probably not going to boost vaccine compliance. This finding was stunning for many immersed in vaccine advocacy, and that's one reason the study made headlines. The research found that even when some misperceptions were corrected by exposure to vaccine education materials, the intention to vaccinate among research subjects did not rise. So misperception lowered, but intention to vaccinate did not rise. The intention even decreased among those with the strongest vaccine concerns. So in this study, I'm going to put up the results now. I'll go through them in a second. In this study, 1,759 Americans with at least one child under the age of 17 living at home were polled for their baseline beliefs about vaccines and then randomly assigned to one of four pro-vaccine pamphlets or a control message. The control message was about bird feeding, totally unrelated. Their vaccine beliefs were then tested again after the intervention to see if there had been any changes in attitudes and beliefs. So these are the studies. You'll see on the left-hand column are the 4 intervention arms. The first intervention was called autism correction, and it debunked the myth that vaccines cause autism. The pamphlet cited multiple epidemiological studies that failed to find a link between vaccine exposure and rates of autism. The second message was entitled Disease Risks, and this pamphlet that parents read listed the many unpleasant symptoms and serious risks associated with contracting measles, mumps, or rubella. Disease narrative was the third intervention, and it told a terrifying story of an infant nearly dying from measles, which he had contracted from another child in a pediatrician's waiting room. Now, to increase the generalizability of the results, these 3 interventions were adapted from the CDC website, but their source information was withheld in order to avoid biased interpretation based on the subject's prior views about this organization. The fourth and final intervention was called disease images. It was disturbing photos of young children suffering from measles, mumps, and rubella with the rashes, the scabs, pretty unpleasant photos. So the researchers measured 3 dependent variables of interest. You'll see that along the top horizontal axis. First was parents' perception of whether the MMR vaccine could cause autism in a healthy child. The second was parents' opinions of the likelihood of a child suffering from serious side effects from the vaccine. And the third was the parents' intention to have their own child vaccinated. The final results of the study were disappointing. They showed that none of the interventions increased parents' intention to have their child vaccinated. There was some limited success in diminishing misperception of the dangers associated with vaccines. You can see in the autism correction message that there was decreased perception that vaccines cause autism, but the other concerns, the concerns about serious side effects, remained the same in the group. In disease risk, we see that there was no change in perception of the apparent risks of vaccine-induced autism or the side effects. The messages were even, some of the messages were even detrimental in some ways. Both the disease narrative and the images of sick children actually increased parental concern about the risks associated with vaccines. So before they'd had the image, had the intervention, they had a certain level. After they saw the intervention, which was supposed to convince them to feel better about vaccines, they were actually more concerned than they were before. And turning back to autism correction, even though there was that success in decreasing some misperception, it also made the parents with the highest pre-intervention opposition to vaccines less likely to vaccinate their children. So most felt the same, but the ones with really strong beliefs actually became less likely to vaccinate. The pre-intervention intention to vaccinate had been about 70% in that group. After exposure to the autism correction message, the subject's intentions to vaccinate dropped to about 45%. This was pretty stunning. We saw that disease risk and disease narrative also had a very small, probably negligible decrease in intent to vaccinate among that really hardened group, the ones really opposed. But it probably was negligible, so it's not worth really paying attention to. Disease images produced intention to vaccinate that was near identical to the control group, so there was no change in intention. So the research team referred to the phenomena of this decreased intent to vaccinate, like I said, only among the most hardened individuals, as a backfire effect. And they saw this response as, I'm actually quoting from their discussion section here, broadly consistent with the literature on motivated reasoning about politics and social issues. When confronted with disconfirming evidence, they wrote, respondents brought to mind other concerns about vaccines to defend their anti-vaccine attitudes. So with this claim and a few citations for good measure, Nayan and colleagues redirected vaccine pundits to a literature on the psychological propensity we all have for biased assimilation of information and arguments and the resulting polarization of attitudes. The phenomena was described in this classic 1979 study as followed. I'm just going to read this quote. People who hold strong opinions on complex social issues are likely to examine relevant empirical evidence in a biased manner. They are apt to accept confirming evidence at face value while subjecting disconfirming evidence to critical evaluation, and as a result, to draw undue support for their initial positions from mixed or random empirical findings. Thus, the result of exposing contending factions in a social dispute to an identical body of relevant empirical evidence may be not a narrowing of disagreement, but rather an increase in polarization. The literature employs the term motivated reasoning, but they also use as several other similar terms. There was biased assimilation that was used in that 1979 paper. There's confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias, motivated skepticism, motivated social cognition, identity protective cognition, and all of these terms, there's slight differences between them, but they're all working to capture this phenomena of biased preferencing of information that confirms prior held beliefs. Motivated reasoning and its synonyms characterize a cognitive process whereby a person's goals or motives directs, or we might say motivates, one of several positive cognitive mechanisms, such as biased information search. We seek things out that sound right to us. Biased assimilation of information. We pick out that information that actually coheres with what we believe. And we do this in order to generate a goal-supporting perception of belief. So if you've heard these terms before, it might have been in some of the popular psychology writing. It's often employed to explain how misinformation persists. It was recently used, in recent years it's been used to explain the idea of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the birther and deather theories of Obama and the death of Osama bin Laden. However, the literature says that we all engage in motivated reasoning. This is not because we don't want to know the truth, many of us do, but because the truth is sometimes too threatening to our self-identities and the values we cherish. Motivated reasoning is driven by a desire to avoid cognitive dissonance, a feeling of conflict between some aspect of our attitudes, behaviors, and our beliefs. When we're faced with this discordance, for example, when we confront disconfirming evidence of something we really feel sure about, subjects might move the goalpost or develop some kind of elaborate rationalizations in order to justify maintaining those prior beliefs. We are motivated to relieve this cognitive tension. So we might do things like challenge the factual claims by bringing in counter evidence. When that's not possible, as is often the case when non-experts interact with published scientific writing, we may challenge the legitimacy of the source. We'll ask whose interests are being served, who funded this study? Or we might find another reason to hold on to the now threatened belief. We saw this in some of the participants in the vaccine study. They reconciled disconfirming evidence about the dangers of vaccines by bringing other vaccines concerned to mind. So maybe vaccines don't cause autism, but what about the mercury and the other toxins in vaccines? What about vaccine side effects, and so on? Vaccine hesitancy and resistance, I think this suggests, is about much more than not liking vaccines. It signifies a constellation of attitudes and behaviors that comprise our social identity. Motivating reasoning enters because of a perceived need for maintaining a valued identity, particularly membership in a social group. So if what I'm describing sounds like some kind of cult-like adherence to our prior beliefs, you would actually be right, because the term, at least insofar as the term cognitive dissonance, was first used precisely in the context of a cult. This is a great story that I'm happy to share. The phrase was famously coined by psychologist Leon Festinger and colleagues in their 1956 study of members of a doomsday cult the day after the anticipated apocalypse fails to materialize. In the summer of '54, Festinger read a short news article about a small local apocalyptic cult that was organized around a Minneapolis housewife and alleged clairvoyant named Dorothy Martin. You can see the picture of her on the screen. She communicated with an extraterrestrial that prophesied the end of human civilization on December 21st, 1954. Festinger decided to infiltrate the group, posing as a true believer, in order to study how Martin and the cult members would react on the morning of December 22nd, once it became obvious that the prophecy had failed. On December 21st, Martin's followers gathered in her home to wait in anticipation. As midnight passed, they waited and waited, and they grew restless. Then Martin received a message that she repeated to the group. Their strong faith had delivered a force of good and light and had saved the world. As Festinger described it, I'm quoting his book, it was an adequate, even elegant explanation of the disconfirmation. So their powerful faith had prevented destruction. Although Martin's predictions had been falsified, the believers were now even more convinced of her gospel. They began sending out press releases, recruiting new believers. The believers had reacted to the dissonance of being wrong by becoming even more certain that they were right. In that way, they seemed to rationalize the situation in a way that maintained their sense of self-esteem. This discussion about cults and recalcitrant beliefs is not meant to suggest the impossibility of reason. That's not the case. Instead, the lesson is that reason is not divorced from emotion. Our desire to belong, the threat of exclusion, can direct the mental operations that assimilate information. We are capable of reason, but the processes involved are infused with emotion. Okay, so now I'm going to move over to a new term, but a related one, the cultural cognition of risk. Sometimes called cultural cognition for short. So cultural cognition is the tendency to base one's factual beliefs about risks, say the risks associated with getting vaccinated, on cultural appraisals of an allegedly risky activity. So similar to the other terms we've already reviewed, motivated reasoning, cognitive dissonance, cultural cognition is a term that holds up identity-protective cognition as the most salient dynamic in disputes over policy-relevant science. The focus on culture is unique. Cultural cognition theorists emphasize group identity, specifically how feelings of belonging to a social group affect cognition. So this is how it's different from motivated reasoning. It's sort of a motivated reasoning plus culture. We might engage in motivated reasoning not just to avoid dissonance between one aspect of our behavior and our personal beliefs, but to protect our ties to others. There is a cultural cognition research group at Yale University, and they're leaders in this area of study. And they study how the motivation guiding the processing or assimilating of information, whether scientific evidence, policy arguments, the credibility of experts, leads to conclusions that reinforce the status of and one's standing in important social groups. The research can also explain the divisions between political and cultural groups on the perceived risks of complex social issues, like global climate change and vaccines. So this is sort of their general framework. The cultural cognition research divides value systems into two main axes, and they take this from sociological theory. The vertical axis corresponds to values pertaining to just distribution of social goods and resources, things like wealth, power, entitlements, and duties. Those with hierarchical orientations, you see that on top, favor their distribution according to relatively fixed social markers like age and gender and race, and therefore they seek to maintain these orderings. Meanwhile, egalitarians tend to reject the idea of ranked hierarchies in the distribution of social goods. Along the horizontal axis is the relationship of the individual to society, leftward emphasizing a higher emphasis upon individuals and competitiveness, rightward emphasizing group solidarity over the individual. So characterizing these people along these two sociological dimensions, characterizing people's general beliefs and outlooks along these two sociological dimensions is said to permit a fairly straightforward sociometric for determining where individuals stand on a variety of social issues. Well, why is that? Well, it's because we make decisions, including evaluations of factual claims, that reflect and reinforce some view of how society ought to be organized. So individuals who value equality and community, what we usually call progressive values, tend to support public health initiatives like mass vaccination campaigns. So when these people come across science supporting these measures, like studies indicating the safety of vaccines or the efficacy of mass vaccination campaigns, they will be ready to accept it as sound evidence. Those who lean towards more individualistic beliefs will likely have negative attitudes towards vaccination programs and look at the same research findings skeptically, if not dismissively. This is why two people can look at the same evidence and perceive it so differently. This is also why facts, mounting evidence, strong science, and consensus statements are not winning the war on vaccines, climate change, GMOs, or other contentious issues. It's not because the naysayers are anti-science, it is because they perceive the science consensus to be less secure than the supporters do. Both supporters and deniers of the scientific consensus on vaccines hold some understanding of how vaccines fit into their own constellation of identity-defining values and beliefs, their own worldviews, let's say. For the naysayers, because accepting such information as legitimate could drive a wedge between them and their peers, they have strong emotional predispositions to reject it. Some of those same pressures are on the supporters too, to suppress any doubts, for example. I'm going to now move to the last term, which was conspiratorial ideation, beliefs in conspiracy theories. Now, 1 year before Nyan and colleagues released their study, another study into vaccine hesitancy and biased reasoning had gathered some attention. Specifically, a study demonstrating that people who believe conspiracy theories were 3 times more likely to refuse vaccinations. This study is listed there by Lewandowski and colleagues. Conspiracist ideation is the general tendency to endorse conspiracy theories. These theories explain events as secret acts of powerful, malevolent forces. For example, popular conspiracy theories allege that the 9/11 attacks were orchestrated by the US government, that Princess Diana was murdered by elements within the British establishment, and that the NASA moon landing was faked. Conspiracy theories are also plentiful among opponents of controversial science policy issues like vaccines, GMOs, climate change. In those theories, undesirable scientific findings are construed as hoaxes. These theories reflect suspicion and mistrust of scientific institutions, framing science as an instrument that is characteristically abused by those in power. Anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, for example, commonly propose that the pharmaceutical companies stand to make such significant profits from vaccines that industry insiders bribe their researchers to fake their data, cover up evidence of harmful vaccine side effects, and inflate statistics on vaccine efficacy. Government agencies then collude with these business interests and strengthen the guise of good science in the public interests. Here are just a few images I found. Conspiracy ideation is a blunter cognitive instrument than motivated reasoning. It permits a wholesale rejection of multiple scientific propositions rather than rejection of some and not others. For example, a positive view of free markets actually predicts the rejection of scientific findings with potential regulatory implications like climate science, but has no impact on attitudes towards vaccine science. So that's an example of motivated reasoning. It does a sort of selection of what's legitimate, what isn't. Conspiratorial thinking is broader in scope. It works to undercut the epistemic force of the scientific consensus. Consensus statements like the IPCC reports on climate change, the Institute of Medicine's report on adverse effects of vaccines, are claimed to not represent the result of researchers converging independently on the same informed view. Thus, because of that, conspiratorial attitudes are associated with the endorsement of multiple conspiracy theories rather than selective uptake. The finding is that if you believe in conspiracy theories, it's a good predictor that you are going to be opposed to climate science, GM foods, and vaccines, all of them. So conspiratorial thinking is therefore usually understood to be a cognitive style rather than a product of misinformation or lack of education. Its cognitive attributes are very different from scientific reasoning. Conspiracist ideation does not need to conform to the criteria of consistency and coherence that we usually find in scientific reasoning. It's not uncommon for conspiracy theories to endorse contradictory theories like Princess Diana was murdered and Princess Diana faked her own death. Therefore, the explanatory reach of conspiracy theories is usually greater than the competing scientific theories. Conspiracy theories and conspiracist ideation is also typically immune to falsification because contradictory evidence can be incorporated into it. So contradictory evidence like climate scientists being exonerated of accusations can be accommodated by broadening the scope of the conspiracy, saying something like exonerations are a whitewash. Those cognitive attributes make conspiracist ideation well suited for the ongoing rejection of scientific evidence. It's hard to counter it because there's always a way of explaining away the evidence. So I'd like to bring this terminology of biased reasoning together. I want to propose that rather than demonstrating that you can't change an anti-vaxxer's mind, which is what many took these studies to mean, investigation into the psychology of misperception instead suggests that vaccine hesitancy problem has been largely misconstrued. The dominant thinking has been that vaccine hesitancy stems from scientific illiteracy or public misunderstanding of science. So that's still the popular framework for understanding vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine fears and skepticism were thought to stem from this information deficit. You've got wrong beliefs, and that leads to this sort of hesitant or skeptical attitude. This new approach suggests something that's almost opposite, that the misperceptions about vaccines are reflections of less favorable attitudes towards vaccines, not the cause. So turning it right into the other direction. Also, the research into identity-preserving motivated reasoning, cultural cognition, and conspiratorial ideation does not conclude that nothing can be done. That was sort of a media spin on this research. Things can be done to unhinge stubbornly held misinformed beliefs. It's only that we have to go about it differently, what might be called using indirect means instead of direct means. So while direct responses to misperceptions entail addressing the informational error, you have a false belief, I try to correct that misperception. Indirect strategies instead address the surrounding values and attitudes that make uptake of corrective information so threatening. Indirect methods work to lessen the threat in order to make individuals more responsive to new information. So take away the threat and people become more open-minded. I'm going to speak a little bit about some strategies with good records of success. These are indirect means that have not been applied to vaccine hesitancy, but they've got a good track record, and I think they are promising. I'll start with the first one, which is called self-affirmation. Self-affirmation theory is actually well studied in psychology, and it focuses on how individuals adapt to information or experiences that are threatening to their self-concept or sense of self. So instead of targeting instances of false beliefs, this strategy seeks to validate or affirm the individual's competence or character or some other beliefs they hold dearly. It's really about making people feel good about themselves. Successful self-affirmations are known to make individuals more responsive to information that might be considered extremely threatening. American social psychologist Claude Steele popularized this theory in the late 80s. I cited the paper best known for that. And this theory's been successfully applied, at least in experimental settings, to help individuals cope with stress and fight low self-esteem. So to counteract feelings of poor self-worth, participants would either write down or say aloud some positive moment from their past that made them feel good about themselves. It could be unrelated to the task at hand, just something that feels good. It's been shown that college students who do self-affirming writing exercises before writing a final exam perform much better than those who don't. Self-affirmation exercises also diminishes the negative impact of prejudice and stereotype threat, where students perform better at tasks where the poor performance is socially expected. For example, women doing math and computing. Self-affirmation exercises has also showed improvements in performance in a variety of demanding tasks from public speaking to weight loss. So it's only very recently that self-affirmation was investigated as a strategy for false belief correction. The knowledge that persistent false beliefs stem from issues closely tied to our conception of self prompted this new direction of inquiry. Nyan and colleagues are actually among this group of researchers. They've explored self-affirmation in the context of correcting political misinformation. It hasn't been done on vaccine hesitators yet. I hope it will be. Rather than correcting or augmenting facts, they followed the strategy of targeting people's beliefs about themselves. And they got positive results in some papers that just recently came out. People that felt good about themselves were more willing, more open-minded to listen to factual claims that they might have found threatening. Of course, we won't always have opportunities to write essays before we make big decisions. It's not really known how long the effects of self-affirmation last. But this finding, I think, should at least make us mindful of how to approach politically charged issues. The next one is the use of a diverse set of experts. And I have a study to show you an experimental program here. Because people interpret information through a variety of cultural cues, another promising way for mitigating public conflict over scientific evidence is to make sure that sound information is supported by a diverse set of experts. So this image here is from a study by the Cultural Cognition group, and it was regarding the HPV vaccines. Researchers found that they were able to substantially reduce polarization by exposing their subjects to advocates with diverse values on both sets of the issue. People feel that it is safe to consider evidence with an open mind when they know that a knowledgeable member of their cultural community accepts it. So for example, the researchers found when they gave a platform to a spokesperson that is likely to be recognized as a typical traditional parent with hierarchical worldviews, so that's the two images on top, maybe it's the tie, it can help dispel any association between mandatory HPV vaccination and the condoning of permissive sexual practices. So that same message given by someone who looked somehow congenial to people that you trust was more accepting when given by the right person. The third strategy is to tie facts to congenial values. Tie facts to values that you hold. So you'll recall that cultural cognition theory proposes that culture is prior to facts. So because of that, empirical evidence or empirical data can be expected to persuade individuals to change their views only after individuals come to see the implications of that evidence to be compatible with their core cultural commitments. So again, the Cultural Cognition Research Group tested this. They wanted to see whether they could break culturally entrenched associations of factual claims about climate change by tying it to more congenial values. So this is what they did in the study that I've cited. Kahan and colleagues measured the response of research subjects to reading a scientific study demonstrating that the anticipated effects of global warming would be far more catastrophic than had been previously thought. They primed their subjects, who represented the full political spectrum, by first having them do a little reading. One experimental arm first read a news report featuring an expert calling for strict carbon dioxide restrictions. The second group read about the promise of geoengineering to counteract human-induced climate change. Maybe you've heard of geoengineering, but I'll define it just in case. So geoengineering is this innovative wonder. Things like towering carbon scrubbers that would suck carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the injection of iron pellets into the ocean to stimulate carbon-consuming phytoplankton blooms. And my personal favorite is deploying zillions of mirror-coated nano-sized flying saucers into the stratosphere to create a solar reflection. This is great stuff. I hope I see that in my lifetime. So when asked to evaluate and there was a third group that read something completely unrelated. They were the control. So when asked to evaluate the climate change study, the one about global warming being more terrible than we thought, cultural cognition was evident in the parsing of who accepted and who dismissed the study's finding. The control group, who had first read that article about something totally unrelated, demonstrated the expected range. The hierarchical individualists responded more skeptically than the egalitarian communitarians to the study. And that's been found again and again in studies about climate change. Now, among the group who had read the call for increased environmental regulation, the polarization was more dramatic. Hierarchical individuals were extremely dismissive of the findings. By triggering antagonistic associations between climate change and restrictions on the free market, this news report increased the polarization among people with different worldviews. The geoengineering group, in contrast, demonstrated a very encouraging convergence of responses to the factual claims proposed in the study. So what was the difference? It was the idea that human ingenuity is up to the task of managing environmental risks. That's a theme that powerfully resonates with people with individualistic and hierarchical outlooks. The researchers predicted that the substituting of this identity-affirming yes, we can narrative through human ingenuity, through innovation and technology, substituting that narrative for the denigrating we told you so one, which animates most climate change policy messages, that would mitigate rejection of the evidence among people most predisposed to do so. And it did. It made the people most likely to be against the finding more open-minded to it. Dan Kahan, the lead researcher, wrote about this in an editorial in the Washington Post. And it was a nicely titled editorial that he called, You Can Change the Minds of Climate Change Skeptics. So with these strategies in mind, what would a promising pro-vaccine intervention look like? I'd like to show you an ad campaign that's been running in Western Australia called I Immunize that I think captures some of the important themes regarding identity and biased information processing. So here's an example of this ad that has been up on billboards and other places. So the target of this community-based campaign is a city in Western Australia called Fremantle. It's a city known for a sort of natural living, alternative lifestyle community. Its demographics are said to be very close to Portland, if that helps. And Fremantle has some of the lowest rates of vaccine compliance in the country. So here in this ad, we see Andrew, a dad, carrying a baby in a sling with the message, I use cloth nappies, that's diapers for you Americans, I eat whole foods, and I immunize. So what we're doing here is denying the trope of the whole foods or natural living vaccine refuser. That's a characterizing that we heard a lot of last year during the Disneyland measles outbreaks with those coastal Californians. They were often called whole foods people in the papers, and they also had low rates of immunization. This ad is suggesting instead that you can be an eco-parent and still vaccinate your children. There is no cognitive dissonance in these choices, this lifestyle. In more ads like it that ran for several months, were introduced in the series to your new community that share those values, where you can sustain feelings of belonging and acceptance. Another thing what's interesting about this ad campaign is that it focuses on values shared by community members rather than on the science. One of the ad campaign's originators is Katie Atwell, a resident of Fremantle and a professor of political science at Murdoch University, and also she's one of the models for this ad campaign. She conducted an online survey to gauge community members' responses to the ad campaign, and here's her publication on that. The researchers wanted to know whether it improved feelings about vaccines and whether it actually increased intention to vaccinate. So they found a general increase in positive attitudes towards vaccines among all respondents, even minimally so among those who were most opposed to vaccines. There was a slight increase in intention to vaccinate in all respondents except for a slight decrease in intention among those that were most highly opposed to vaccines, so some kind of backfire effect. So they were able to conclude that while these ads didn't work miracles, it did change the minds and even behaviors by at least opening up the possibility of vaccine acceptance for those committed to an alternative lifestyle, at least opening up that idea that you can have that alternative lifestyle and immunize, and there's no tension between that. So there are also some similarities between this ad campaign to the intervention involving diverse experts that I told you about. Now these members of the community, these actually are people that live in the community. They're peers, they're not experts. But the campaign similarly capitalized on culturally recognizable dress and behaviors that made the information provider seem trustworthy. Trustworthy because he or she shared the same values as the viewer. So in closing, I'd like to conclude that you can change an anti-vaxxer's mind, but it won't be easy. We won't succeed in changing committed anti-vaxxer's mind by countering his or her misbeliefs with corrective factual information. That's been tried. It doesn't work. It is uncomfortable in the context of science denial because facts and evidence are precisely what science usually offers to these heated science policy debates. The psychology of misperception, it seems to be telling us that we are all deeply motivated to hold on to the beliefs that we all find important. But changing the conversation so that some facts are not so threatening is possible. And I think this is the new direction for research and for public health. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. I'm going to send Magda around with a microphone so we can get you on the video and everybody can hear your question. So please raise your hand and we'll come around to you. I'm going to flip it on.
Enjoyed your presentation. I have two questions. It seems that resistance to vaccination has really been around as far back as Jenner's development of smallpox vaccination.
That's right.
Why do you think this lingers or even gets more and more vigorous? And the second question is, yesterday, I believe, was the 61st anniversary of the announcement of the success of polio vaccine. If you take that kind of positive data and give it to your anti-vaxxers, does it influence them?
Okay, two good questions. You're right that historically vaccine resistance and refusal is as old as vaccines themselves. And the reason for that is, first of all, it's scary. People find it unfamiliar and strange to put deadly viruses, to willfully put viruses into our bodies. Jenner had the resistors of that too. There's a religious element to that, an idea that there's at least some religious elements that think you're not supposed to corrupt your body with these kinds of interventions, but I think that's a slightly antiquated view. There's also tensions about the state having the authority to control what people do with their bodies. With vaccines also came a history of vaccine requirements. When there were smallpox outbreaks, there was required vaccination programs that would be put into effect, all for the sake of public health, all for the sake of protecting populations. So there was always the sort of fear factor and the individualist bend that said it shouldn't be up to the state to decide how we protect ourselves, how we protect our children, and so forth. So I think that explains why vaccine resistance has always been the case. It might seem more pronounced now. The current anti-vaccine movement is probably started somewhere around Andrew Wakefield's publication in The Lancet in 1998, where he alleged that there was a connection between the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism. That's where this idea first took hold. And even though that paper's been discredited, it's hard to get away from that. There's much more information out there. The internet also plays a role in that. There's the same fears are there, but there's also through the sort of democratization of knowledge, there's also more opportunities to read various opinions on it and meet people who are like-minded like you, who think like you. So it's sort of when you meet people that think like you, the ideas tend to get stronger and more reinforced. So there's a technology aspect to vaccine resistance too. The second question, what do people think about the 60th anniversary of the invention of the polio vaccine? I doubt that would have much impact on vaccine refusers who have come up with elaborate rationalizations of why vaccines are, if not dangerous, at least not very effective. There's arguments like changes in hygiene over the years are the source of decreases in disease outbreaks, not the vaccines themselves. But it does give you pause to think about how things have changed. And when Salk came up with the polio vaccine, he was a hero. He was on the cover of Time magazine. They had a parades for him, ticker tape parades, and the like. And people lined their children up around the block to get vaccinated. This was a good thing. Now people that invent vaccines get death threats. I'm thinking of Paul Offit, who's a vocal pro-vaccine endorser and the co-creator of the rotavirus vaccine, and he gets death threats. He has bodyguards and the like. He's public enemy number one to the anti-vaccine community. So I don't think that event is actually too significant to anti-vaxxers. It is significant to people that are curious about the sort of historical progression of it when I say, wow, times have really changed. Thanks for your questions.
I think some of the differences between Salk and Offit might have to do with the fact that Jonas Salk donated all of his, or he didn't collect royalties on his vaccine.
That's right.
And was seen maybe as a public hero because he could have collected a whole ton of money off of that, whereas Offit does collect money off the rotavirus vaccine, as far as I'm aware. But I have two questions.
He admits that openly. He says, my invention has made me extremely wealthy. And of course that gets pointed to. His nickname, you can Google it, is Paul for Profit Offit for that reason. Yeah, so he's got a credibility problem in light of the earnings he's made off of his invention. Yeah.
Right. What in particular about vaccines makes it such a great vector for conspiracy theories and anti-vaccination theories, as opposed to other medical treatments that don't have conspiracies? You don't hear people talking about how beta blockers don't work and statins are the enemy and they cause autism, and all that. My second question is there any research into normalcy bias as a possible cause for anti-vaccination beliefs? Because I think a lot of people who hold anti-vaccination beliefs do it because they see vaccines as potentially harmful and they see what vaccines prevent as something that's never going to happen to them. I've never had rubella before. I don't know anyone that's had rubella. I don't know anyone that's had polio. So why should I give my son something that's potentially harmful if there's no benefit?
Right. Two good questions. So what's unique about vaccines that inspires this kind of concern? I don't know. I would really like to know. You're right. There isn't really anything quite like it. I've thought about this, but I can only speculate on what's different about vaccines that get people so upset. And people that don't vaccinate usually still use traditional, conventional medicine. They might believe in alternative medicine. Many of them do. They use these homeopathic preparations that are claimed, probably not, but are claimed to actually boost immunity naturally, and no evidence of that actually being true. So in many ways they're accepting of the medical establishment, except the vaccines. It's always the vaccines. And I think there's a few things that strike me as unique about about vaccines is that it is actually exposing your children, so of course parents are tend to be highly concerned people. They want to do the best for their kids, and you're actually exposing your kid to illness. It's most of the medical interventions we do, especially for children, is to counteract. They're sick, we fix it. They're sick, we fix it. This is actually a preventative measure with serious risks involved. They're rare, but there are serious adverse events. So I think that is scary. Needles apparently are very scary to some people. There's been some research saying that needle pain is sort of an under-researched and underappreciated aspect of fears of vaccines. So now you've got flu shots that are a nasal mist instead of the needle, and they're hoping that that'll take away some of the resistance around vaccines. So those are some possibility. There must be more to it, but again, I'm only speculating. I don't know what makes it so unique. There's actually something I have heard about that might help explain it. Is it's also the kind of reasoning that parents use when they say, what if my kid was the one that had the severe adverse reaction? How would I live with myself because I'm the one that agreed to the vaccine, as opposed to if the kid got measles, if the kid was seriously had some serious reaction from it, that isn't my fault. So there's something, that feeling of moral responsibility seems to be part of it. So I guess it's probably a gathering of all those things. As for your second point about parents that haven't seen it, that is actually a popular explanation for why people don't want to give vaccines to their kids, because they think they can ride the herd. They haven't seen it. There's myths out there that, hey, maybe measles isn't that bad. Well, people that have lived through it will tell you, no, it's not that bad. Like people like in my parents' generation, measles isn't that bad until it is bad, and then it's really bad. Polio is slightly unique from that. Polio was always bad. And so there is a little bit of lack of experience. There's a term that you'll see a lot if you read about vaccines. Vaccines are a victim of their own success for that reason. And that seems to be a common progression, that as we don't see the disease around us, we start to focus more on the other things, like those rare, serious side effects. So having said that, people wondered, well, now that we've had a few mass measles outbreaks, now that we've had whooping cough throughout California and other places, is that changing people's minds? And at least for now it isn't. There's been research that came out of California saying parents have not been motivated yet to do it. But the reasoning, people still stand to reason that eventually it'll get so bad that parents will become more fearful. But that remains to be seen. Thanks for your questions.
Hi. Do you feel like going forward, not just for like vaccines, but I guess in general, a lot of different things, that this is going to be the, I guess, right approach to kind of like what you were saying, climate change, vaccines, everything in general? Like it almost kind of reminds me, this may not be the best example, but it's like when I was a little kid, I used to like despise tomatoes more than anything. And then my mom was like, you eat ketchup. And then it was like, it clicked. Like, are we going to have to kind of tell a group of people that they eat ketchup for every kind of argument? I don't know if that's the best example, but...
Yeah, I think your example is actually more like the informational model, where you're saying, well, don't you see? You clearly misunderstand what a tomato is. I can only sort of offer, promise here that I think this sounds like a good approach. We can be sure that the educational model is not working. A lot of resources have been invested in it. Seriously, if good information was going to change people's minds on vaccine hesitancy, it would have happened already. There is a ton of good information out there. There's so many studies, so much convinced. I don't even want to talk about the evidence. It's so compelling. So try something else, and I think this looks promising. I'm offering this as a promising view, but I tried to add the caveats that we haven't. It hasn't. A lot of this hasn't been studied outside of a laboratory setting, but at least what has been done looks pretty good, and also when I think about sort of the, as is the sort of theme of this lecture series, this sort of connection with values and how we interpret evidence, this seems like it's on the right track. So I say it with a lot of hope. Thanks.
Obviously a biased presentation, but no, just kidding. You kind of alluded to it when you talked about the whooping cough in California and stuff as consequences, and I was just wondering if anybody has been able to figure out how to study what the level of consequence before people do start reacting. So I've had this theory that we should just put all the anti-vaxxers kids in the same classroom. So
They usually are in the same classroom, right?
okay.
They live in sort of clustered communities is what I mean.
Right,
or they
right.
go to
So,
Waldorf
but I'm
schools
just
or
wondering,
something.
and this would apply to a lot of things, the
Yeah.
consequences of, flooding against somebody who's not acknowledging climate change
Yeah.
or any of that. Is there any research done on changing people's minds by
Right.
consequences?
Right, so the question is how bad does it need to get? I don't think there's been research on that. I told you how Californians, there hasn't been a major shift in thinking about it, and well, now the whole California is different now. Now they actually are required, if you want to go to a daycare or a school, you have to get vaccinated. They got rid of their personal belief exemption last year, but that's likely to drive the movement underground rather than make people actually comply, because people don't like being told what to do. So but I can't answer your question, how bad does it need to get? Chances are it probably depends on your prior beliefs. The people, I use the terminology now is vaccine hesitators, which I actually didn't define, but I should. It just means any sort of uncertainty around vaccines. So the research used to be done on vaccine refusers, which is actually a very small percent of the population, people that actually don't vaccinate their kids and would never vaccinate their kids. What you have actually a large proportion of, and I've seen some studies that say 40% of American parents are vaccine hesitators, at least some doubts, a little bit of fear, and that can range from a little bit fearful, but you still do it anyway, to extremely fearful and you wouldn't vaccinate your children at all. So chances are seeing measles cases around you is going to get the slightly fearful on board, but it's going to take probably more than an outbreak to get the very, very strongly opposed to do it. They would need to see a lot to change their views, and they are probably going to do the kind of elaborate rationalizations like maybe this is a good thing in the end. Maybe it's boosting that natural immunity that is so much better than vaccine-induced immunity. You could rationalize that away, and you can probably tolerate a lot of illness before you drop those views. That's my guess.
Hi, which methods do you think contributed to the success of the anti-tobacco campaign?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't studied the anti-tobacco campaign very much, and that's something that would be very good for reflection. So there was definitely changes in perception of lifestyle that did it. It used to be that smoking was just a thing you did. It's something that everyone did, and to tell people not to smoke was seen as a major imposition. And over the years, I doubt it was the health claims. It's usually not the health concerns that change behavior. It's changes in style, changes in the status around it. So it probably had to do more with changes in fashion. But that's all I can say on the subject. That would be a really, really interesting comparison. Because you're right, that was a major public health problem, and the behavior did change quite a bit.
Hi. I wanted to ask, the same way that there are people who oppose vaccines, some are more obstinate than others, some are just hesitant. On the other side, there are people who, they lack the information, the scientific literacy, but they kind of believe in this infallibility of science and the scientific process. Mm-hmm. And we know that, science can sometimes have an agenda. So do you think it's a little bit dangerous, especially to get into this conspiratorial ideation, which kind of sounds like a way of dismissing the opposition without actually parsing the evidence?
You're right to bring that up, and you're right that science can be corrupt and has been corrupt. I'm certainly not one to say that the pharmaceutical industry is clean. And it's actually interesting that now it's a difficult time to say that. If you read op-eds and talk about the subject, I've noticed the conversation usually stops if someone says, yeah, well, the pharmaceutical company, they're not exactly they're not exactly a well-respected industry. And that was something that people would say just a few years ago. But now it gets tied into anti-vaccine sentiments. So I think you're absolutely right that parsing is important here. I brought up conspiratorial ideation not because I'm endorsing anything about it, only because it is some of the terminology that's been used in this sort of turn towards biased cognition. And I think that part is useful. At the same time, even that kind of thinking can be mitigated by things like self-affirmation exercises. But no, I'm not trying to dismiss the pharmaceutical industry for bad behavior. They have certainly done that. And I think that's part of the conversation that has become harder to have, but is important to have. So I appreciate that point. Okay.
So since we live in like this individualistic culture here in the U.S. and I mean, I guess in Canada too, I lived in Canada, so I kind of have that mentality. Is it different for other cultures with this idea about vaccinations, about vaccinating your children? Because I know you talked a lot about how it's like a cultural phenomenon almost. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about other cultures?
The research that I've done is on, and the claims that I make were probably only applicable to the industrialized North. There is a whole different brand of anti-vaccine sentiment in countries with civil war and strife, where vaccine campaigns are seen as some kind of government intervention to assist in genocide. And that's happening in Western Africa, in Syria, and a few other places. So sticking with the sort of northern industrialized countries, the anti-vaccine sentiment seems to be around, and it's always, at least what's expressed, is the same concerns around health and safety and mistrust of the biomedical institutions. It's not clear that there is a more individualistic sentiment in the United States compared to others, even though our sort of political leanings are suggested to be like that. Some of the sort of qualitative research into vaccine deniers, it's usually not because they're unconcerned about other kids. It's that they think their primary role as parents is to take care of their kids, and other people should take care of their kids too. So although anti-vaxxers get criticized for being selfish, for not caring about the health of the population, that doesn't really pan out, at least in this sort of self-understanding of what they're doing. So it's not clear that takes us very far.
Within the community of acceptors and realizing public health implications of universal acceptance, has any effort been put toward identifying the characteristics of the individuals who might be harmed by some of the qualities of the vaccines, so that people would feel safe about bringing their children, because they could find out if their children have those sensitivities and might not be successful candidates?
It's a good question, and those proposals have been made by some anti-vax groups. There's a well-known group in the UK called JABS, Justice. Oh, I can't remember. First word was justice, but it's an anti-vaccine group that has been around since the 90s. And in 2002, they created a statement that got circulated quite a bit, calling on government and medical agencies to research exactly that. They said, that's what we're concerned about. We're concerned about adverse events. Why don't you start doing a better job determining which kids are going to be affected by it? And I think the policy is not to respond to these kind of statements because it's seen as maybe playing into the public fear. So I don't know of any response to that. Is there research into that? Yes, but it's certainly not getting the kind of attention that the studies, like these repeat studies of epidemiological studies showing, look, this country introduced the MMR vaccine in 1995, and look at rates of autism. They did not go up at all. That's the study that gets the attention, even though I think you have like hit on something perfect there, that's the concern, and that's the kind of study that might actually change minds. Despite everything I said, that it's not about the evidence, that's actually what's interesting about that is not just that you could perhaps mitigate some of the fears, but it's actually being responsive to the people that are making these demands. And that's part of the tension between anti-vaxxers and all these agencies, is they feel like they're not being taken seriously. Parents going to their physician's office, usually mothers, feel like they can't talk about this issue because they just get marginalized. So, a little understanding would go a long way too. So your point is a good one. Hi.
I have two questions that are related. The first is there or has there been research into the possibility of the anti-vaxxer mindset spreading to more parents believing that their kids should not get vaccinations? And the second question is, how can the anti-vaxxers affect the vectors of different viruses that we haven't seen for many decades at this point?
So for the first question, I don't think there's actually been research about the spread of these ideas. Has been research into where parents get their information and about vaccines, and is it online? Is it from anti-vaxxer websites? Is it from your physician? And the answer to that is usually your peers. A lot of people might talk to their physician, but not necessarily take what they say to heart, because their physician they expect their physician to just toe the line on vaccines. You've got to get vaccinated. It's important to get vaccinated. They're safe. That kind of thing. People tend to trust their peer groups more than anything. So if their peers have already been exposed to this and find it compelling, that word of mouth is going to generate increases in anti-vaccine views. And that might explain why we find that unvaccinated children usually live in close proximity to each other. So the word on vaccines is that our rates of exemption are still fairly low. Most places have a fairly high amount of vaccine compliance, and that's good news. The problem is that unvaccinated children tend to cluster together. They live in the same communities. They go to the same schools and that kind of thing. And that's because the parents are talking to each other. And it's not that they all ended up there together, but they learn from each other. So that's what we know about the spread of the information. Remind me your second question?
It was about the spread of the vectors, how the anti-vaxxer mindset can change the vectors of these viruses that have not been around for, at this point, many decades.
I guess the answer to that is every outbreak that has happened in recent years. So measles was eradicated from the U.S. in 2000. I mean, eradicated doesn't mean 0 cases, but it means there's a number for that, a certain number of years with a very low level of cases, and we say it's gone. And then it came back, and every outbreak has been attributed to unvaccinated children. So it's spreading. So it's this anti-vaccine sentiment is actually the cause, at least is causing these outbreaks to happen. It's causing the public concern. It's fueling both sides, the pro-vaccine and the anti-vaccine debates. So that's the direction of things.
I don't mean this to be a morbid question, but do you think that natural selection will help cull the herd of the anti-vaxxers? And because they live together and share media and they talk a bunch. If someone in that group dies, do you think that'll help cull the ideological spread?
There have been very, very few deaths. That's a funny way of putting the question, but there have been very, very few deaths as a result of these outbreaks. There have been a few, and they've been usually very, very young infants. But medical care is good if you have it, and most people do not die from this. So I don't think natural selection is going to do the job.
I have a question. With the recent years of advertising of various medications on television and emphasis at the end of advertising of negative side effects of each, I wonder if this also spreads the fear factor, is emphasized in the people that have a mindset of not trusting anything, and if that has spread more mistrust than actually trust to the science, because their emphasis, oh, go and tell your doctor to prescribe this medication, but wait, it can cause cancer, diabetes, you may faint or have anemia, and you know, that's what they hear last, and then that's what they remember.
I'm sure there has been social science research into that. What does the listing of the adverse events do to actual compliance? But I'm not familiar with it. But I can't imagine it being negligible to everyone. Some people are going to be concerned about that. When you read anti-vaccine information and websites, which I do, I read a lot of them, they'll often write things like, have you read the insert for the vaccine? And they'll list the things that they said, and they sound terrible. The truth is most people don't read the insert. Your doctor shows up with the medicine, you take it, and that's it. But those that do read it are probably looking for something, and they find it in that insert, absolutely.
Can I pick up on something else in that comment, and that has come up in some of the other comments, which is the term trust or mistrust? What role does that have to play in the mistrust of science, or trusting scientists have to do in the attitudes or cultivating better attitudes? What do you think?
I think it's all about trust. I'm writing a book on vaccine hesitancy, and guess what it's called? Public trust. And I suggest just that I think it's largely a question of trust, and I'm offering trust as the problem, as opposed to the information deficit as the problem. That I'm not interested if you're a conspiracy theorist or not, but there is a trust problem with respect to our medical and governmental institutions. When we take medical advice or public health advice, we are usually not in the position to evaluate all the evidence and to do it well. Unless you are infused right into that research community, we take a lot of things on trust. There's a good, you probably know this, there's good philosophy on epistemic trust, and it points out that even the most rational person will take a lot of things on trust because we don't have time to research everything for ourselves. So the who you trust issue is always there. Most people trust their physicians. Most people don't trust the pharmaceutical industry. I said it, I'm allowed to say it. And people have trouble, the conversations are largely about who do you trust. I've done some research on some of the major anti-vaxxer proponents, and Andrew Wakefield, for example, despite the fact that he is discredited as a fraud, someone that had conflicts of interest and made up the study in order to pursue certain financial goals, is still a hero among the anti-vaccine community. And why is that? It's because he's seen as someone who stood up against a corrupt medical institution, as someone that was actually willing to fight for the parents. So he, at least in the eyes of people that were already hesitant about vaccines and skeptical about the medical community, he's seen as the person to trust. So in our lives, we trust experts all the time, whether it's our physician, whether it's a public health official, whether it's the anti-vaxxer doctor. It's about who is the person that resonates with you. And I think there is a trust problem in medicine that is stemming these kind of concerns. And I think there could be ways of addressing it. We talked about Paul Offit and his financial interests. I look at that and I say, well, it's obviously, whether he could be the best researcher in the world, he could be the most sincere vaccine advocate out there, and at least his followers and his fans say he is, but his financial ties are getting in the way. It's keeping people from being able to take him as trustworthy for a variety of reasons. So why don't you find a vaccine advocate who doesn't have financial conflicts of interest? How hard would that be? So I think it's largely about trust. We need to trust people, and if their credibility is in question, you have to find someone who's more credible.
One more quick question.
Actually, an observation. Everything you've just said about trust and mistrust in science could also be applied to politics and governance.
Yeah.
If we look at some of the interesting but to some alarming results of our last 9 months in politics, a lot of it is about whether there is trust or lack of trust, whether it's on both our major political parties here.
Right, because we're not always privileged to the relevant information, so we need to trust people. That's how we learn things.
Okay, please join me in thanking our speaker.